Have you noticed something? I picked up a couple of magazines the other day, and I was looking at predictions, and I was looking at unit rankings, and a lot of this stuff to me is more entertainment than information, simply because, I've told you many times, I don't think there's skill in predicting a season a whole lot to begin with, but especially as I sit here, before we haven't had a spring and won't have a spring, before we have any kind of feedback from camps and whatnot, I mean, how is anyone predicting anything? But I digress. I understand why it's done. So I'm reading some of these magazines, and I found something funny. Predict what you want to predict. I just want to look at the reason. I want to look at the logic behind it. If I'm going to predict Florida to win the SEC East, you better believe I'm not going to, in the same magazine, tell you, I think Georgia's got the better offensive line. I think Georgia's got the better defensive line. I think Georgia's got the better quarterback, but I'm going to still predict Florida to win the division. Make it make sense. Anyway, consequences of success are something that we talk about on this show a lot. Dan Mullen in Florida could be ready to deal with some of those consequences of success. Here's one of the consequences. If you've been 7-5 forever, you can go into a season and lose a game to your biggest rival, but if you still go to a New Year's Six game, that's a big deal. Florida's done that 2 years in a row now. They've had really good years. There's no criticizing Florida. They've had really good years. Now you get the consequence. Good enough is no longer enough. I'm over on the Swamp 24/7 message board today. That's the Florida branch of 247sports.com. And I was asking some of the folks over there, I'll get to their answers in a second. I was saying, hey, I know what your expectation is, likely know your expectation this year, but if Florida doesn't achieve that, what do you think? See, here's the good news for Florida right now. The good news, and there's a lot of it, the good news is Mullen's in year 3. So, you take your thumb as a head coach and you press it against your program. Well, year 3, you can pull the thumb away. I mean, your fingerprint is firmly entrenched on the program. For better or for worse, it reflects you as a head coach. So if you believe in Dan Mullen, that's very good news. You've got Kyle Trask at quarterback. In fact, it's just nice to know what you're going to have at quarterback, period. Much less knowing you've got a very skilled and now veteran option at quarterback. So you've got certainty there. You've got stability along your coaching staff. Your schedule is very favorable this year, as favorable as it can get in the SEC. Everything's been geared towards 2020. Everything. And it's like, if you're at a restaurant, you keep getting appetizers. And, that one was good, and that one was really good, but eventually you're ready for the main course. 2020 is the main course for Florida. And if 2020 brings out another appetizer for them, they are not going to be happy at all. So as I told you, I go over to Swamp 247 today. And I just ask kind of a version of, it's all well and good if Florida wins the East. If they don't, you go from sky-high expectation to losing the East, again, presumably to Georgia. And if it's not due to catastrophic injury, like if Kyle Trask and 5 other starters don't go down and you just lose the division straight up, what is your reaction? So I got a couple of reactions here. Gator Fanatic 24/7, which sounds almost like a corporate Florida fan. I'm not mad at it, though. The expectation is to win the East this year. Anything less is a failure. We have elite depth at quarterback, basically 2 starting caliber guys, experienced O-line, good talent at the skill positions, probably the most veteran secondary we've had since Muschamp. In my opinion, if Mullen can't beat Georgia and win the East this year, my confidence that he ever does it will be slim to none. I want you to think about what he just said. I think that's what the majority of Florida fans feel like. I believe that's probably very close to being in line with what I think about Florida. I'm not ready to give you a prediction on the East. I have no clue. You might as well throw a dart against a board right now in lieu of getting my prediction. But I will tell you this, there's immense pressure on Dan Mullen. When it comes to major programs, you may very well be accurate in saying there is no Power 5 head coach of note out there at a program expected to contend that has more pressure on his shoulders than Dan Mullen this year. Because what I just read from the poster there, that is the collective attitude. And it's my attitude towards Florida too. If not now, then when? Everyone's talking about closing the gap. Everyone's talking about what it's going to take to beat Georgia and then what it's going to take to recruit closer to being on par with them. And the answer is usually, well, beat them. Show recruits you can beat them. That does a lot to convince guys to go to Gainesville instead of Athens. But quarterback is there. Offensive, you look at the offensive coordinator. I mean, think about this. This is not just in a vacuum. You got all the positives I just told you for Florida, but think about what's happening in conjunction with all this at Georgia with the quarterback position. They got confidence in Jamie Newman. They don't really know what they have. He's not a proven commodity there. New offensive coordinator. You lose spring. They've got a tougher schedule than you do. Their two cross-division opponents are at Alabama and Florida. You got LSU at home, and you got at Ole Miss. There are scenarios where you could lose to Georgia and still win the East. A lot of you told me that would be bittersweet, but sweet nonetheless. People just don't appreciate. I think a lot of folks don't appreciate. A lot of folks really don't appreciate how thin the margin is here and how a few games and really a few drives in a few games are going to be the difference in Dan Mullen being unequivocally called the top head coach in the SEC East versus people saying it's time to start thinking about the long-term future here because if he couldn't have gotten it done this year, when is he ever going to get it done? That is the high wire act that you have to perform when you've gotten to this altitude yet. When you're operating at this altitude, but you haven't won a title yet, this is where you find yourself. Now, logic would tell you, if you're just a cricket fan and you know nothing about football, and I were to tell you, okay, on one hand, everyone believes in this dude, and they're so jacked about this year, and a lot of people think he's going to win, but if he doesn't, they're going to say, screw it, let's go to someone else. Cricket fan would say, that's stupid, however cricket fans talk. They may be right, but hey, you fully invested in your program too. Fan investment is A+. You want an A+ return on the investment. That's totally fair. We led this show off tonight talking about Michigan. I think there is a lot of similarity to where Florida's program is right now, as we sit here in 2020, going into the 2020 season, as Michigan was going into that 16 season. There was a lot of momentum. There were a lot of believers. And there were a lot of people who had that game against Ohio State circled, and they go into overtime. I remember it as vividly as it happened yesterday. I'm sitting in the press box at Bryant-Denny Stadium. Iron Bowl has already started. I'm watching this laptop computer screen, and I think that is not a first down, but yet they call it a first down, and Ohio State goes on to win the game, and Michigan really never the same after that. And a lot of people in retrospect, maybe they didn't say it at the time, but a lot of people in retrospect have now looked back on that game, and they've said, that was the line of demarcation. If he would have won that game, Colin and I were just talking about this before the show. If Harbaugh wins that game, if Michigan wins that game, and they go on to win the division that year, and probably the conference, they're a playoff team. Who knows what they do in the playoff? The point is the history books look totally different. And it was that close. It was quite literally, I'm holding up a piece of paper, it was that thin, the margin was that thin between Harbaugh being thought of as a guy who has overtaken the Big Ten versus a guy who cannot get it done in the big game against the big rival, and he chokes, and we're never going to make the playoff. That's this altitude. You want to operate at an 8-5 altitude? Coming close and making a nice bowl game, you're going to get confetti raining down on you. But if you want to operate at the Tier 1 big boy altitude, you got Tier 1 big boy consequences when you don't get it done. And that is why, for Dan Mullen's sake, I sure do hope these preview magazines are right. And I sure do hope all these number one projections come to pass, because if they don't, you won't have to worry about anyone in the media crucifying him. You're going to have to worry about a lot of Florida fans doing a long, hard look at their head man and saying, if we couldn't get it done in 2020, I mean, no offense, but when are we ever going to get it done? Turf C, by the way, was another poster on the Swamp 24/7 board today. He kind of flipped it. This is brilliant. I told Turf, I think you run a talk show somewhere. He said, I think it'd be interesting to flip the question and ask this. If this is not the year Georgia wins it all, then when is Georgia going to win a national championship? If Georgia loses to us this year, does that change everyone's perception of Kirby? I think the narrative of Kirby being an overrated coach would be pretty loud if we beat them this year and they don't make it to the playoff. My friend, you're probably dead on the money accurate. I just don't think that is tonight's show, because I was only prepared to talk about Florida. That is a good point, though. He's not wrong.